shadows of occupied France, 1943, a transaction that defies humanity unfolds. A desperate father exchanges his own daughter for a sack of potatoes, while German soldiers look away, indifferent to a child's tears. But in that moment of ultimate betrayal, when all hope seems lost, a lone American soldier watches from the shadows, his heart burning with a moral choice that will change everything. What begins as a simple rescue soon spirals into a deadly game of secrets and betrayal. As bullets fly and truths unravel, this unlikely pair, a wounded soldier and a traumatized child, discover a document stained with blood that threatens the highest ranks of Allied command. Now they're running for their lives, hunted by both sides in a war where loyalty has become a luxury no one can afford. Will he keep his promise to protect her when the entire world seems determined to tear them apart? And what happens when the most devastating betrayal comes from those sworn to protect them? The cold wind whistled through the ruins of the small French village, carrying the scent of gunpowder and despair. It was 1943, and hope had become as scarce as food. The rationing lines stretched like wounded snakes across the cobblestone square, each person's eyes fixed on the ground, afraid that looking up might reveal the hunger etched on their faces. German soldiers watched with suspicious glares, fingers resting on triggers, ready for any sign of rebellion. Among the crowd stood a black girl with enormous frightened eyes, her small fingers clutching her father's calloused hand as if it were her only anchor to this world. Her stomach twisted into knots not just from emptiness but from the peculiar tension radiating from her father's body. Each breath she took felt shallow, incomplete, as though the air itself was being rationed along with everything else. Her father's face, once gentle and full of laughter, had transformed during these war years. Deep lines carved paths from his sunken eyes to his tightened jaw, and something lurked behind his gaze, something that made her heart flutter with unease. When he looked at her now, it wasn't with the warmth she remembered from before the occupation. Instead, his eyes seemed to appraise her, calculating something she couldn't comprehend. "Come," he muttered, his voice rough as he tugged her away from the main line. Her shoes scraped against the ground as she stumbled to keep up with his determined stride. The cold bit through her threadbare coat, and her breath formed small clouds that disappeared too quickly, like the childhood she was losing day by day. They approached a makeshift storehouse at the edge of the square, a building with windows covered in planks and a door that opened just enough to let one person slip through. The smell hit her first, an odd mixture of potatoes, tobacco, and something metallic that made her nostrils flare. A man stood in the doorway, his silhouette blocking the dim light from inside. His skin was pale, almost translucent, with blue veins visible at his temples. When he smiled, his teeth appeared too large for his mouth. "You've come back," the merchant said, his eyes flickering between her father and her with an intensity that made her throat tighten. "I told you yesterday. The price remains the same." Her father's grip on her hand tightened painfully, and she felt a tremor run through his arm. Was it fear? Hesitation? She couldn't tell, but something inside her screamed danger with every heartbeat. "There's nothing else I can give," her father whispered, his voice cracking. "We haven't eaten in 3 days." The merchant's eyes narrowed as he examined her from head to toe. Not as one would look at a child, but as one might assess livestock at market. Her skin crawled under his gaze, and she instinctively tried to step behind her father's leg. Something about this exchange was terribly wrong, and her young mind scrambled to make sense of the words floating between the adults. "A sack of potatoes," the merchant muttered, just loud enough for her to hear. "Not much in these times, but it's what we agreed upon." Her breath caught in her chest, trapped like a bird in a snare. What were they talking about? The world seemed to slow around her, details suddenly sharp and clear, the sweat beading on her father's forehead despite the cold, the merchant's fingers drumming against the doorframe, the distant cries of a baby somewhere in the village. Before she could process what was happening, rough hands grabbed her shoulders, pulling her away from her father. The merchant's fingers dug into her thin arms, and the pain shocked her into screaming. Her voice echoed through the narrow street, bouncing off stone walls and shattered windows. "Papa!" she cried, reaching out as the distance between them grew. "Papa, please!" But her father didn't move, He stood frozen, his eyes now fixed on a burlap sack being handed to him by another man from inside the storehouse. People passing by turned their heads away, quickening their pace. A woman pulled her own daughter closer, whispering something in her ear. Everyone saw, but no one stopped. In a world where survival had become the only currency worth anything, compassion had become an unaffordable luxury. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She had been exchanged, traded like an object. Her father had sold her for food. Her small body shook with sobs that tore through her chest, each one feeling like it might break her ribs. The merchant dragged her toward the dark entrance of the storehouse, his grip unyielding despite her struggles. Through tears that blurred her vision, she saw her father clutch the sack of potatoes to his chest, his face a mask of shame and relief, a combination that would haunt her forever. Just as the darkness of the storehouse was about to swallow her, a figure appeared among the soldiers patrolling the square. He stood taller than the others, his uniform different, American, not German. What was an American doing here, in occupied France? The soldier's eyes locked with hers for a brief electric moment across the square. Unlike the vacant stares of those who had turned away, his gaze held something fierce. Indignation, yes, but also something deeper, something that made her struggling pause. The American took a single step forward, then another. His hand moved slowly toward the holster at his hip. The German soldiers hadn't noticed him yet, too busy harassing an old man for papers. The merchant, sensing the girl's distraction, yanked her roughly toward the door. In that suspended moment, a choice hung in the air between them. The soldier's jaw tightened, a muscle pulsing visibly along his neck. What could one man do against armed enemies in their territory? What madness would drive him to intervene for a stranger, a child he had never seen before? Yet something in his expression shifted, hardened into resolution. He took another step forward, moving out of the shadows and into full view. The storeroom air hung heavy with the stench of mold and forgotten goods. Darkness pressed against the girl's eyes as the merchant pushed her through a narrow doorway, his fingers digging into her shoulder like talons. Wood creaked beneath their feet, and somewhere in the gloom, water dripped in a slow, maddening rhythm. The space felt vast yet suffocating, filled with shapes she could barely discern. Crates stacked against walls, ropes hanging from ceiling beams, and what looked like bundles of clothing piled in corners. "Stay quiet," the merchant hissed, his breath hot against her ear. "You'll be of use soon enough." He shoved her toward a stack of empty potato sacks that lay crumpled in a corner. Her knees buckled as she hit the floor, the impact sending shockwaves through her thin frame. Dust particles danced in the single shaft of light that slipped through a crack in the boarded windows, illuminating her trembling hands as she gathered herself into the smallest possible target. The merchant moved toward the front of the storeroom, muttering to himself in a mixture of French and German. The words blended together, but fragments reached her. Good price, healthy enough, northern factory. Each syllable hammered another nail into the coffin of her childhood. She wasn't being taken for ransom or adoption. This was something far worse, a transaction with no return. The door slammed shut, plunging the room into deeper darkness. Only then did she allow herself to breathe, shallow, ragged gasps that caught in her throat. Her mind spun with disconnected thoughts, her father's face as he traded her away, the potatoes that were worth more than her life, the cold that now seemed to come from inside her bones rather than the air around her. Outside, barely audible through the thick walls, came the sound of footsteps. Heavy yet cautious, they moved with purpose, not the casual stride of the merchant or the methodical march of German soldiers. These steps belonged to someone who didn't want to be heard, someone who paused between movements, listening. The American soldier pressed his back against the exterior wall of the storeroom, his breath creating small clouds in the cold air. His heart hammered against his ribs so loudly he feared it might give him away. What he was doing defied all military logic and self-preservation. If discovered, he would be labeled a spy or deserter, either accusation carrying a death sentence. Yet the memory of the girl's eyes haunted him like a silent scream, compelling him forward despite every rational thought that told him to turn away. He'd seen much during his months behind enemy lines. Villages burned, families torn apart, unspeakable cruelties justified in the name of war. But something about this particular transaction had broken through his carefully constructed emotional barriers. It wasn't just a war crime. It was the casual nature of it, conducted in broad daylight as if trading livestock. Inside the storeroom, the girl strained to hear those approaching footsteps, holding her breath until her lungs burned. They stopped just outside. For several heartbeats, nothing happened. Then came the softest scraping sound, metal against metal, as someone worked at the locked door. Her muscles tensed, preparing to run, though there was nowhere to go. The door opened a crack, allowing a sliver of twilight to cut through the darkness. A silhouette appeared, tall and broad-shouldered, blocking what little light there was. The girl pressed herself deeper into her corner, pulling a potato sack over her body. If she couldn't run, perhaps she could hide. "Hello?" The voice was barely a whisper, distinctly American in its pronunciation. "Is anyone in here?" She remained frozen, unsure if this was some kind of trap. The merchant could have accomplices, or perhaps the Germans had found her father and forced him to reveal where she'd been taken. Trust had become a luxury she could no longer afford. The soldier stepped fully inside, closing the door behind him to avoid detection from the street. His eyes adjusted slowly to the darkness, scanning the cluttered space. Something moved in the corner, a subtle shift of shadow against shadow, and his hand instinctively moved to his holster. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said, keeping his voice low. "I saw what happened in the square." The girl remained still, hardly daring to breathe. The American took another step forward, and a floorboard creaked beneath his boot. He winced at the sound, glancing nervously toward the door. "I don't have much time," he continued. "Neither of us does, but I can get you out of here." His eyes finally located her huddled form in the corner, a small mound barely distinguishable from the other discarded items. He moved closer, crouching down to appear less threatening. In the dim light, he could see her eyes now, wide, terrified, yet somehow still defiant. "I'm here to help you," he said, extending his hand palm up in a universal gesture of peace. "I'm going to take you away from this place." She eyed his hand suspiciously, her small body coiled like a spring ready to release. After what her father had done, how could she trust anyone, especially a stranger in a foreign uniform? "They'll be back soon," he urged. "We need to move now." Something in his voice, a genuine concern that couldn't be feigned, made her hesitate. She studied his face, the worried crease between his eyebrows, the tightness around his mouth, the way his eyes kept darting to the door. This wasn't the calculated look of someone with ulterior motives. This was the face of a man risking everything on impulse. "I'm getting you out of here," he repeated, his voice firmer now. Her hand, small and dirty, emerged from beneath the potato sack. It hovered in the air between them, trembling slightly. The soldier remained perfectly still, allowing her to make the choice. In that suspended moment, something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement that once their hands connected, both their lives would irrevocably change. When her fingers finally touched his, they were ice cold. He closed his hand gently around hers, feeling the fragility of her bones, the pulse fluttering beneath her skin like a trapped bird. She was real, not just another wartime atrocity to witness and carry silently. In saving her, he was committing to something he couldn't yet fully comprehend. "My name is David," he whispered, helping her to her feet. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, a sound froze them both in place. Outside, boots crunched on gravel, the distinctive, rhythmic cadence of German soldiers on patrol. The girl's hand tightened around his, her nails digging into his palm. Their eyes met in the darkness, a shared understanding passing between them. Discovery meant death for both. The footsteps grew louder, stopping just outside the storeroom door. German voices murmured, and metal clinked against metal, rifle straps being adjusted perhaps, or ammunition checked. The soldier pulled the girl deeper into the shadows, his body positioned between her and the door. His hand moved to his sidearm, knowing full well that if those soldiers entered, he couldn't possibly win. But he might buy her enough time to escape through the back. Their breaths mingled in the darkness, shallow and controlled. The girl pressed against him, her small body trembling, not with fear now, but with a strange determination. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. The doorknob rattled. David's eyes darted frantically around the darkened storeroom, searching for escape as the doorknob continued to rattle. His military training kicked in: assess, adapt, overcome, but the girl's presence complicated everything. He couldn't fight his way out, not with her to protect. Just as the door began to creak open, David spotted it, a small trapdoor partially hidden beneath a stack of empty crates in the corner. With one swift movement, he scooped the girl into his arms and dove toward it, sliding the crates aside with his foot. The hinges protested as he yanked the door open, revealing a black void below. "Trust me," he whispered, lowering her into the darkness first. He followed immediately after, pulling the trapdoor closed above them just as German voices filled the storeroom. They landed in a cramped earthen cellar that smelled of damp soil and rotting vegetables. The space was barely large enough for both of them, forcing David to cradle the girl against his chest as they huddled in complete darkness. Her heart hammered against his, their breath mingling in the cold, stale air. Above them, heavy boots stomped across wooden floorboards. Objects crashed to the ground as the soldiers ransacked the space, their angry German voices filtering through the thin trapdoor. Each footstep directly overhead sent dirt cascading onto them like rain. "Where is she?" a voice demanded in heavily accented French. The merchandise was not to be moved. The merchant's high-pitched reply came quickly. "I haven't touched anything. She must have escaped while I was out front." A sharp crack echoed, flesh meeting flesh, followed by a pained yelp. "Find her," ordered the German officer. "She is required for the northern factories. The quota must be met." The girl trembled against David, her fingers digging into his uniform. He placed a gentle hand over her mouth, not to silence her, she hadn't made a sound, but to reassure her, to form a connection in the darkness. Her breath was warm against his palm, a reminder of the life he was now responsible for. Minutes stretched like hours as the soldiers continued their search, overturning crates and stabbing bayonets into sacks of grain. Finally, after what seemed an eternity, the boots retreated, the door slammed, and silence descended once more. Still, David didn't move. Experience had taught him that enemies often waited in silence, hoping to catch escapees who emerged too quickly. He counted his heartbeats, 100, 200, before finally reaching up to push against the trapdoor. It opened with a soft creak, revealing a storeroom now transformed by chaos. Crates lay splintered across the floor, sacks had been slashed open, their contents spilling out like pale entrails. Through the cracks in the boarded windows, David could see that twilight had descended, casting long shadows across the ravaged space. "It's safe now," he whispered, lifting the girl out of the hole before climbing out himself. "But we need to move quickly." Outside, curfew sirens began their mournful wail, signaling that anyone found on the streets would be shot without question. The village would soon be locked down tighter than a drum, with checkpoints at every intersection and patrols sweeping the alleys. David peered through a crack in the boarded window. The street appeared deserted, but experience had taught him that empty streets in occupied territory were often the most dangerous. Snipers watched from hidden positions, waiting for the slightest movement. "We'll head for the American camp near Belleville," he said, more to himself than to the girl. "It's about 5 miles east through the forest. We'll have to avoid the main roads and checkpoints." The girl nodded, her eyes never leaving his face. She hadn't spoken a word since he'd found her, but her gaze communicated volumes. Fear, yes, but also a determination that belied her young age. They slipped out through a back window, dropping into an alley strewn with debris from recent bombings. The moon hung low and full in the sky, casting enough light to navigate but also making them dangerously visible. David pulled his dark jacket around the girl's shoulders, hoping it would help her blend into the shadows. Every few steps they paused to listen. The village had transformed into an acoustic minefield, distant German voices, boots crunching on gravel, dogs barking from behind fenced yards. Each sound forced them to freeze, pressing against walls or ducking behind bombed-out vehicles. The girl moved with surprising stealth, her small feet finding secure footing among the rubble without making a sound. She seemed to understand instinctively when to move and when to hold still, following David's lead with an unnerving precision that spoke of previous experience evading danger. They reached the eastern edge of the village, where crumbling stone walls gave way to open fields bathed in moonlight. Beyond lay the dark line of the forest, their best hope for cover, but also the most exposed part of their journey. 200 yards of open ground lay between them and the tree line, with nothing but waist-high grass to conceal their movement. "We'll have to run for it," David whispered, kneeling to look the girl in the eyes. "Fast as you can, straight for those trees. Don't stop for anything. If you hear shots, just keep running, understand?" She nodded, her jaw set with determination. "On my count. 1, 2. Before he could say 3, a shout erupted behind them. A patrol had turned the corner, spotting them against the moonlit wall. David grabbed the girl's hand, abandoning stealth for speed. "Run!" They bolted across the open field, tall grass whipping against their legs. The girl's hand clutched his with surprising strength as they tore through the night. Behind them, shouts turned to gunfire, sharp cracks that split the air, followed by the whistle of bullets passing overhead or thudding into the earth around them. David zigzagged, pulling the girl with him in an unpredictable pattern to throw off the soldiers' aim. 60 yards to the forest, 50, 40. Each step bringing them closer to temporary safety, each second pregnant with the possibility of a bullet finding its mark. The girl stumbled once, her foot catching in a hidden rabbit hole, but David swept her up without breaking stride, carrying her the remaining distance. They crashed through the first line of trees just as a volley of gunfire shredded the foliage around them. Deep into the forest they ran, branches clawing at their faces, roots threatening to trip them with every step. Only when the sounds of pursuit had faded did David finally slow, setting the girl down beside a massive oak tree. Both collapsed against its trunk, lungs burning, hearts racing from exertion and fading adrenaline. The forest enveloped them in relative safety, its dense canopy blocking most of the moonlight. Nighttime creatures resumed their chorus, owls hooting, small mammals rustling through underbrush, a reassuring soundtrack that meant no humans were nearby. "We'll rest here for a moment," David whispered, checking the girl for injuries. "Then we need to keep moving east." She nodded, still silent but watching him with those enormous, evaluating eyes. He offered her his canteen, and she drank greedily, water dribbling down her chin in her haste. Just as David was about to suggest they continue their journey, a sound froze him in place. Not the mechanical noise of soldiers or vehicles, but something more primal and desperate. Someone was calling a name. A man's voice, ragged with emotion, carried through the trees. "Elise! Elise!" The girl's head snapped up, her body suddenly rigid. Recognition flashed across her face, followed immediately by something darker. Fear, perhaps, or confusion. David tensed, hand moving to his sidearm. "Do you know that voice?" She nodded slowly, lips parting as if to speak for the first time since he'd found her. But before any words could form, the voice called again, closer now. "Elise, please, I can explain." David peered through the darkness, trying to locate the source. Between the trees, a silhouette materialized, a man moving with the desperate energy of someone with nothing left to lose. The girl's fingers dug into David's arm, her breathing shallow and rapid. It was her father. David's heart skipped a beat, muscles coiling like a spring as he instinctively positioned himself between the girl and the approaching figure. His fingers hovered near his sidearm, ready but hesitant. Killing a German soldier was one thing. Taking the life of a civilian, even one who had committed an unthinkable betrayal, was another matter entirely. "Elise," the man called again, his voice cracking with emotion. In the dappled moonlight filtering through the trees, David could make out his haggard appearance, clothes hanging loosely on an emaciated frame, eyes sunken deep into their sockets, the desperate look of a man who had been running. The girl, Elise, shrank back against the tree trunk, her small body rigid with tension. Tears welled in her eyes but didn't fall, as if she was struggling between the instinct to run to her father and the fresh memory of his betrayal. "Stay behind me," David whispered, straightening to his full height. The father stopped short when he spotted them, his gaze locking first on David's uniform, then darting to his daughter partially hidden behind the American soldier. His hands rose immediately in a gesture of surrender, fingers splayed to show he carried no weapon. "Please," he said, his accent thick but his English comprehensible. "She is my daughter. I have come for her." David kept his stance wide and protective. "You sold her for potatoes." The words came out hard as stones, each one carrying the weight of judgment. The father flinched as though struck. "You don't understand," he pleaded, taking a tentative step forward before freezing when David's hand moved more deliberately toward his gun. "I was forced. They made me do it." "No one forced you to trade your child like an animal," David replied, disgust evident in his tone. "They threatened to kill us both if I didn't cooperate." The man's voice rose with desperation before he caught himself, glancing nervously over his shoulder. He lowered his voice to an urgent whisper. "I had no choice. They have been watching us for weeks." Something about his manner struck David as odd. The way his eyes darted around, the subtle tremor in his hands that seemed born of more than just emotion. There was fear there, certainly, but also something else. A nervousness that didn't quite match his story. "Who are they?" David demanded, not relaxing his stance. The father swallowed hard, Adam's apple bobbing in his thin neck. "The Germans. They have lists of useful people, children who can work in factories, girls who—" He couldn't finish the sentence, shame closing his throat. Behind David, Elise shifted slightly, her breathing growing more rapid. He could feel her small hand clutching the back of his jacket, her fingers digging into the fabric like claws. She didn't trust her father's explanation any more than he did. "So you decided to hand her over yourself? Before they could take her?" David's tone made it clear what he thought of such reasoning. "No, I was going to follow, to find where they took her. I had a plan to rescue her after nightfall." The words tumbled out too quickly, rehearsed almost. His right foot tapped an irregular pattern against the forest floor, a tell that any experienced soldier or interrogator would recognize. A twig snapped somewhere in the darkness behind the father. David's senses heightened instantly, ears straining to catch any further sounds. The forest had gone unnaturally quiet. No insects chirping, no night birds calling. Something was wrong. "How did you find us?" David asked, voice deliberately casual as his eyes scanned the tree line. The father hesitated a fraction too long before answering. "I followed from the village. I saw you take her from the storeroom." Another lie. The storeroom had no windows facing the back alley they'd used to escape. No one could have seen them leave unless they'd been inside or positioned at a very specific angle across the street. "Elise," David said softly without taking his eyes off the father. "Does he have friends who wear German uniforms?" The girl's grip on his jacket tightened in response, a silent confirmation that chilled his blood. This wasn't a desperate father seeking reconciliation. This was a trap closing around them. "They forced me," the father said again, his voice taking on a pleading quality. "You must believe me. They have my wife, Elise's mother, in custody. They will kill her if I don't bring Elise back." David kept his face impassive, but his mind raced. The story was shifting now, new details being added to make it more compelling. First it was mutual threat, now a captive mother. What would the next version include? "Your wife died of typhus 2 years ago." Elise spoke for the first time, her voice small but steady. The simple statement landed between them like a grenade. The father's expression flickered, surprise, then anger, quickly masked behind renewed desperation. "Elise, you're confused. The fever, remember? You were sick too. Mother is alive, and we must save her." David felt Elise step out from behind him, her courage gathering like a physical force. "I put flowers on her grave every Sunday until the Germans took the church," she said, each word precise and clear. "You sold her wedding ring for bread last winter." The pretense fell away from the father's face like a discarded mask. His posture changed, shoulders squaring as his hand moved to his pocket. "You always were too clever," he said, voice hardening. "It would have been easier if you'd just come quietly." David moved with combat-trained reflexes, pushing Elise back with one arm while drawing his sidearm with the other. "Don't," he warned, aiming center mass at the father. But instead of producing a weapon, the father simply smiled, a cold, terrible smile that transformed his gaunt face into something inhuman. He looked past them into the darkness of the forest and shouted a single word in German. "Higher!" Flashlight beams cut through the darkness, illuminating their position from multiple angles. German voices called to each other as booted feet crashed through the underbrush. They had been surrounded while the father kept them talking. "Run!" David grabbed Elise's hand, pulling her deeper into the forest away from the converging lights. Gunfire erupted behind them, bullets splintering tree bark inches from their heads. They zigzagged through the trees, using the dense forest as cover. "Stop or we shoot the traitor," a German voice shouted in heavily accented English. David didn't slow down, knowing it was another trick, but Elise glanced back, a fatal mistake. In the strobing flashlight beams, she saw her father being held at gunpoint by a German officer. Their eyes met across the distance, and something passed between them, a final understanding, perhaps, or the last fracturing of trust. "He is with them," David insisted, tugging her forward. "Don't look back." The sound of a single gunshot echoed through the forest. Elise stumbled, a small cry escaping her lips. David caught her, forcing her to keep moving even as more gunfire erupted behind them. "They shot him," she whispered, shock making her voice distant. "To make you stop," David replied grimly, pulling her along. "Keep moving." They plunged deeper into the woods, the sounds of pursuit growing fainter as they put distance between themselves and the German patrol. Only when they reached a small stream did David finally allow them to pause, ducking behind a fallen log to catch their breath. Elise's face was blank with shock, her eyes staring unseeing at the dark water bubbling over stones. "He sold me," she said flatly, "and then they killed him anyway." David checked his ammunition and listened for sounds of pursuit before turning to her. "I'm sorry," he said, the inadequacy of the words burning in his throat. What comfort could possibly address such betrayal and loss? "He was working with them," she continued, her voice oddly detached. "For how long, I wonder? Since before Maman died? Since the occupation began?" The pieces were falling into place in David's mind. The father's nervous behavior, the coordinated ambush, the Germans' willingness to sacrifice him. He was their informant, he concluded grimly. Probably identifying families with children who could be taken for labor camps or worse. Elise nodded slowly, as if this confirmation aligned with suspicions she'd harbored but never voiced. "And when they had no more use for him..." She couldn't finish the sentence. A distant shout interrupted them. The Germans regrouping, organizing a more thorough search. They would use dogs soon, David realized. Their scent trail was too fresh, too easy to follow. "We need to cross the stream," he said, helping Elise to her feet. "The water will hide our trail for a while." As she stood, something fell from her pocket, a folded paper, stained dark along one edge. She bent to retrieve it, unfolding it with trembling fingers. In the faint moonlight, David could make out German text and what appeared to be a code name. "He had this in his jacket," she whispered. "I took it when he fell." David gently took the paper, angling it toward the meager light. His German was limited to basic phrases learned during intelligence briefings, but certain words jumped out at him. Coordinates, dates, and a name that made his blood run cold. Operation Foxhole. The breath left his lungs as though he'd been punched. The paper slipped from his suddenly numb fingers, caught by Elise before it could touch the damp ground. "What is it?" she asked, studying his shocked expression. David couldn't answer immediately, his mind reeling with implications. That operation name belonged to a classified American mission, one he had personally been involved with 3 months earlier. A mission that had gone catastrophically wrong, resulting in the deaths of French resistance fighters and civilian informants. A mission that should have been known only to the highest levels of Allied command. The night exploded with gunfire before David could process the implications of the document. Bullets tore through the foliage above them, sending splinters of wood and leaves raining down. With combat-honed reflexes, he pulled Elise down behind the fallen log, covering her small body with his own. as rounds thudded into the rotting wood. "Target located," a German voice shouted through the darkness. Flashlight beams swept across the forest floor, dancing ever closer to their position. David's mind raced through their options, each one bleaker than the last. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and now pinned down against the stream. The document burned in his mind like a brand, but survival had to come first. "When I fire, you run across the stream," he whispered into Elise's ear. "Stay low in the water, then hide in those bushes on the far bank. Don't move until I come for you." Her eyes, wide with terror but remarkably clear, met his. She gave a single nod. David took a deep breath, then rose slightly above the log and fired 3 rapid shots toward the approaching lights. Shouts of surprise and pain confirmed at least one hit. In the momentary confusion, he hissed, "Now!" Elise bolted from behind the log, splashing into the shallow stream. Water sprayed around her ankles as she ran, silver droplets catching the moonlight like tiny beacons. David continued firing, drawing attention to himself rather than the fleeing child. A German soldier appeared on his right flank, rifle raised. David pivoted and fired twice. The man dropped without a sound. Another took his place immediately, and David's pistol clicked empty. In the split second it took to reach for his spare magazine, pain exploded across his left shoulder. The impact spun him around, sending him stumbling back into the stream. Cold water shocked his system as he fell, the current immediately soaking his uniform. Through blurring vision, he saw Elise had made it to the far bank, her small form pressed flat against the earth beneath a tangle of bushes. More Germans approached, their flashlights illuminating David's position in the shallow water. He gritted his teeth against the burning pain in his shoulder and forced himself to move, crawling toward the deeper center of the stream where the current might carry him downstream, away from Elise's hiding place. "Halt! Hands up!" The command came in heavily accented English. David raised his uninjured arm slowly, his mind calculating angles and distances, searching for any possibility of escape. There were at least 5 soldiers that he could see, their rifles trained on his chest. The pain made it difficult to think clearly, but one truth remained crystalline. If he surrendered, Elise would try to help him, exposing herself. He had to ensure she remained hidden. "I'm alone," he called out, his voice carrying across the water. "I kidnapped the girl from the village, but she escaped hours ago, heading north." The lie came easily, loud enough for Elise to hear and understand. "Stay hidden. Don't follow me." The German commander stepped forward, his silhouette sharp against the moonlight. "Search the area," he ordered his men. "Find the child." Soldiers fanned out along both banks of the stream, flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. David watched, heart in his throat, as one beam swept within inches of Elise's hiding place. The bush trembled slightly. Whether from the wind or her trembling, he couldn't tell. "No one else here, Commandant," reported a soldier after several tense minutes. The commander turned his attention back to David, who now stood waist-deep in the cold stream, blood from his wounded shoulder turning the water around him dark. "The American spy," the commander said, a note of satisfaction in his voice. "We have been looking for you." David said nothing, focusing on remaining upright despite the blood loss and numbing cold. Each second the Germans focused on him was another second for Elise to remain undetected. "Your interference has caused much trouble," continued the commander. "The girl was promised to the northern factory. A quota must be filled." "She's a child," David spat, genuine disgust overpowering his tactical silence. The commander shrugged, the gesture visible even in the dim light. "War requires sacrifices from all, even children." One of the soldiers approached the commander, speaking rapidly in German. Though David's grasp of the language was limited, he caught enough to understand they were discussing the father's body, found with a bullet to the head. "A shame about her father," the commander said, switching back to English for David's benefit. "Useful but ultimately expendable. Like all traitors." The casual cruelty of the statement hit David like a physical blow. The father had been executed the moment he ceased to be useful, discarded like a broken tool. Now the same fate awaited him. "On your knees," ordered the commander, drawing his sidearm. David remained standing, defiance his only remaining weapon. "You'll have to shoot me standing." The commander's laugh was cold and brief. "As you wish, American. Your heroics mean nothing. The girl will be found by morning." He raised his pistol, aiming center mass at David's chest. Time seemed to slow, each second stretching into eternity. David's thoughts flashed to Elise, hoping she would stay hidden, hoping she would somehow survive this war that consumed everything in its path. A single shot cracked through the night. For a bewildering moment, David felt nothing. Then the German commander crumpled forward, falling face first into the stream with a splash. Chaos erupted as soldiers scattered for cover, shouting in confusion. More shots followed, precise, methodical, from the darkness of the forest behind them. "American! In the water! Move left!" The shout came in English, from somewhere in the trees. David didn't hesitate, diving sideways as bullets tore through the space where he'd stood. Two more Germans fell before the others retreated, dragging their wounded commander with them. Strong hands grabbed David's good arm, hauling him out of the stream onto the bank. Through the haze of pain and blood loss, he made out the insignia of American uniforms, a patrol from his own unit. "Lieutenant Parker's been hit," someone called out. "Get the medic." "The girl," David gasped, struggling to sit up despite hands trying to keep him prone. Across the stream, hidden in the bushes. Two soldiers immediately splashed across the water, their movements careful and quiet. David watched anxiously as they searched the far bank, his breath caught in his throat. Had she run? Had the Germans found her during the firefight? "Got her." One of the soldiers emerged from the bushes with Elise cradled in his arms. Relief flooded David's system, making him lightheaded. She was alive. As they carried her back across the stream, David could see she was unharmed, but trembling violently, whether from cold or fear or both. When she spotted him lying wounded on the bank, she broke free from the soldier's arms and ran to his side, dropping to her knees beside him. "You're hurt," she said, her small hand hovering over his bloodied shoulder. David managed a weak smile. "I've had worse." The patrol leader, a sergeant David recognized from base camp, knelt beside them. "Lieutenant, we need to move. That German patrol will return with reinforcements." David nodded, wincing as the medic applied pressure to his wound. "How did you find us?" The sergeant's expression grew serious. "Orders came down to locate you immediately. Highest priority. The entire camp is searching a 20-mile radius." Something in the sergeant's tone set off warning bells in David's mind. "Whose orders?" "Colonel Hargrove himself." The sergeant glanced at Elise, then back to David. "Said you'd gone AWOL in enemy territory. Said you might be compromised." The implications were clear. David wasn't being rescued. He was being apprehended. And the timing, coming so soon after discovering the Operation Foxhole document, couldn't be coincidence. "The girl comes with us," David said firmly, struggling to his feet despite the medic's protests. "She's under my protection." The sergeant hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "For now, but the colonel will want to question you both when we get back to camp." As they helped David onto a stretcher, Elise pressed close to his side, her small hand finding his. In her other hand, she still clutched the blood-stained document, the evidence that somehow the most secret Allied operations had been compromised. "Keep that safe," David whispered to her. "Tell no one you have it." She nodded solemnly, slipping the paper into her shoe before anyone could notice. The American patrol moved quickly through the forest, carrying David on the improvised stretcher while Elise walked alongside, never straying more than a few inches from him. The journey was painful, each jostling step sending fresh waves of agony through his wounded shoulder, but his mind remained focused on the growing realization of what they had stumbled into. Operation Foxhole had been betrayed, and the only people who could have revealed it were within the highest echelons of American military command. The American camp materialized like a ghost town through the pre-dawn mist, a collection of tents and makeshift structures nestled in a clearing 2 miles east of Belleville. Sentries snapped to attention as the patrol approached, their eyes lingering with curiosity on the wounded lieutenant and the small girl who refused to leave his side. David drifted in and out of consciousness during the journey, blood loss and shock taking their toll despite the field medic's best efforts. Each time he surfaced from the darkness, his first instinct was to check for Elise. She walked beside his stretcher with unwavering determination, her face set in a mask of adult concern that no child should ever have to wear. As they entered the camp perimeter, David felt her small hand slip into his, her fingers ice cold against his feverish skin. "Don't tell them about the paper," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the bustle of the camp. "Trust no one." She squeezed his hand once in silent understanding before they were separated. David whisked away to the medical tent, while two female aid workers gently but firmly led Elise toward a supply tent that had been hastily repurposed for civilian refugees. "No!" she protested, struggling against their well-meaning hands. "I need to stay with him." "He needs medical attention, sweetheart," one of the women said, her American accent thick with forced cheerfulness. "You can see him after the doctors help him." David tried to call out to her, to offer some reassurance, but a medic was already cutting away his blood-soaked uniform, and the pain when they moved his shoulder sent him spiraling back into darkness. He woke hours later to the antiseptic smell of the medical tent and the distant sound of aircraft engines. Sunlight filtered through canvas walls, casting everything in a warm, deceptive glow. His shoulder was heavily bandaged, the pain dulled to a persistent throb by morphine. A IV line snaked from his uninjured arm to a glass bottle hanging beside the cot. "Welcome back to the land of the living, Lieutenant." David turned his head slowly to find Colonel Hargrove seated beside his cot, uniform crisp despite the early hour, silver eagles gleaming on his shoulders. The colonel was a career military man in his mid-50s, his hair steel gray and cropped close to his skull, face weathered by decades of service. His reputation for ruthless efficiency had earned him both respect and fear among the troops. "Sir," David acknowledged, instantly on guard. "The girl is safe," Hargrove interrupted, his tone revealing nothing. "Being fed and cared for as we speak." Relief washed through David, though he was careful not to let it show too clearly on his face. If Hargrove was involved in the betrayal of Operation Foxhole, Elise was far from safe. "You've caused quite a stir, Lieutenant," Hargrove continued, removing a silver cigarette case from his breast pocket. He extracted a cigarette with deliberate slowness, a man accustomed to being waited upon. "Abandoning your post, entering enemy-occupied territory without authorization, abducting a civilian child." "Rescuing," David corrected, his voice stronger than he expected. "She was being sold into forced labor." Hargrove lit his cigarette, the match flaring briefly in the dim tent. "So I've been told. A noble sentiment. Foolish, but noble." He exhaled a plume of smoke toward the canvas ceiling. "Unfortunately, nobility doesn't win wars, Lieutenant. Following orders does." David said nothing, watching the colonel carefully. There was something performative about this conversation, as though Hargrove were reciting lines for an audience neither of them could see. "The MPs found something interesting when they searched the area where we found you," Hargrove said after a calculated pause. "A dead French civilian, shot execution style. The girl's father, apparently. Killed by Germans," David responded immediately. Hargrove's eyes narrowed slightly. "Convenient explanation." "It's the truth." "Truth is relative in wartime, Lieutenant." The colonel tapped ash onto the dirt floor. "What matters is perception. And the perception right now is that an American officer went AWOL, entered enemy territory, abducted a child, and may have murdered her father. The implication hung in the air between them, monstrous and absurd. That's insane," David said flatly. "There were witnesses. The patrol that found us saw the German unit. The patrol reports seeing unidentified armed combatants, yes, in the dark, at a distance." Hargrove's face remained impassive. "Hardly conclusive evidence." David's mind raced, trying to understand the colonel's angle. Was this about Operation Foxhole, or something else entirely? "The girl will confirm everything I've told you," he insisted. A thin smile ghosted across Hargrove's lips. "Children are impressionable, Lieutenant, easily confused, traumatized by war. Not the most reliable witnesses." Ice formed in David's veins as he realized the full extent of the threat. They could discredit anything Elise said, twist her words, or prevent her from speaking altogether. She was as vulnerable in this camp as she had been in that storeroom. "What do you want, sir?" David asked, dropping all pretense. Hargrove leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to just above a whisper. "I want to know what you found out there. What you and the girl discovered that has you so protective of her." So this was it. Hargrove suspected they'd found something, but he didn't know what exactly. The blood-stained document was still hidden, still secret. "Nothing," David lied smoothly. "Just trying to save an innocent life." Hargrove studied him for a long moment, smoke curling between them like a question mark. "Noble," he repeated, finally standing up. "But I don't believe you." He moved toward the tent entrance, then paused, turning back. "You're being transferred to London for further questioning. Transport leaves at 1600 hours. The threat was implicit. David would be separated from Elise, unable to protect her. "And the girl?" David kept his voice steady through sheer force of will. "She'll be placed with other refugees, eventually sent to an orphanage, I imagine." Hargrove's tone suggested this was an afterthought, barely worth mentioning. After the colonel left, David lay still, mind working furiously, despite the fog of pain medication. The paper that Elise had hidden was evidence of a high-level security breach, possibly treason. If Hargrove was involved, he would stop at nothing to recover it and silence them both. With effort, David pulled the IV from his arm and swung his legs over the edge of the cot. The tent spun sickeningly around him, but he forced himself to stand, gripping the metal frame for support. His uniform was gone, replaced by standard-issue pajamas that offered little protection against the October chill. Moving on unsteady feet, he made his way to the tent flap and peered outside. A military police officer stood guard, rifle slung across his chest. Beyond him, the camp buzzed with morning activity, soldiers performing drills, mechanics working on vehicles, radio operators moving between command tents. Ordinary military routine, but to David's eyes, every figure now represented a potential threat. He retreated back to his cot, knowing a direct escape attempt would fail in his current condition. He needed allies, information, and most importantly, he needed to reach Elise before Hargrove could isolate her completely. As if summoned by his thoughts, the tent flap opened, and a nurse entered carrying a tray of medical supplies. She was young, probably no more than 23, with copper hair pulled back under her cap and freckles scattered across her nose. "You shouldn't be up, Lieutenant," she admonished, setting down the tray. "That shoulder needs complete rest if you want to avoid infection." David eased himself back onto the cot, mind racing. "Sorry, nurse. Wilson. Margaret Wilson." She checked his bandages with practiced efficiency. "Nurse Wilson, have you seen the girl who came in with me? Small, dark hair, about 8 years old." Something flickered across her face, concern perhaps, or recognition. "The refugee child? She's in the civilian tent." She lowered her voice. "She's been asking for you," rather insistently. David felt a rush of affection for Elise's determination. "I need to see her. It's important." Nurse Wilson continued her examination, not meeting his eyes. Colonel Hargrove left strict orders. "You're to have no visitors except medical personnel and MP officers." "Please," David said, dropping all pretense of military formality. "She's in danger. We both are." The nurse's hands stilled momentarily. She glanced toward the tent entrance, then back at David. "What kind of danger?" David weighed his options carefully. Trust was a luxury he couldn't afford, but neither could he navigate this situation alone. He took a calculated risk, the kind that comes from discovering something powerful people want to keep hidden. He said quietly, "Something that could expose a traitor within our own ranks." Nurse Wilson's eyes widened slightly, but her voice remained steady. "That's a serious accusation, Lieutenant." "It's the truth." He held her gaze, willing her to believe him. "I just need 5 minutes with her, to make sure she's safe." The nurse resumed bandaging his shoulder, her movements deliberate as she considered his request. "I can't bring her here. Too many eyes watching this tent." David's hope began to fade, but then she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm scheduled to deliver supplies to the civilian section at noon. Medical checkups for new arrivals." She secured the bandage with a safety pin. I could use an assistant to carry my equipment, even a wounded one. Relief flooded through him. Thank you. She straightened, her professional demeanor returning. Don't thank me yet, Lieutenant. If you're caught, we'll both face court-martial. She gathered her supplies with brisk efficiency. And if you're lying about any of this, I'll turn you in myself. As Nurse Wilson left the tent, David closed his eyes, exhaustion and pain threatening to overwhelm him. The paper Elise had hidden was their only leverage, their only proof. Without it, they were simply a wounded soldier with a suspicious story and a traumatized child no one would believe. He had to reach her before Hargrove realized what they had. Noon arrived with excruciating slowness. David spent the intervening hours drifting between alertness and feverish sleep, his body fighting infection while his mind worked frantically through escape scenarios. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw Elise's face, her trust in him absolute and terrifying in its completeness. When Nurse Wilson finally returned, she brought a corporal's uniform instead of medical supplies. "Put this on," she whispered, glancing nervously toward the tent entrance where the MP still stood guard. "It'll draw less attention than those pajamas." David struggled into the uniform one-handed, pain shooting through his injured shoulder with each movement. The fabric hung loosely on his frame. The uniform's owner was clearly a larger man, but it would serve its purpose. "The guard?" he asked, nodding toward the tent flap. "About to be relieved for lunch. His replacement is running late." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Something about stomach trouble in the mess tent." David raised an eyebrow. "You're doing?" "I may have mentioned to the cook that the replacement guard complained about yesterday's stew." She shrugged, the gesture almost playful despite the tension humming through her body. Amazing how cooperative people can be when their pride is wounded. She helped David into a sling for his injured arm, then handed him a clipboard with medical forms. "Carry this. Look official. If anyone asks, you're assisting with vaccinations for the civilian refugees." The moment the guard left his post, they slipped out of the medical tent. David forced himself to walk naturally despite the pain and weakness, mimicking the purposeful stride of a soldier on assignment. The camp buzzed with midday activity, jeeps kicking up dust as they moved between tents, soldiers gathering for mess call, radio operators hurrying with dispatch papers. They passed the command tent where David caught a glimpse of Colonel Hargrove through the open flap, bent over a map table with several other officers. The colonel didn't look up, but David quickened his pace nonetheless, keeping Nurse Wilson's Red Cross armband in his peripheral vision as she led the way. The civilian section occupied the eastern edge of camp, separated from military operations by a makeshift fence of barbed wire. As they approached the checkpoint, David's pulse hammered in his throat. 2 MPs stood guard, rifles held casually but ready. "Medical team for refugee processing," Nurse Wilson announced, her voice crisp with professional authority as she presented her papers. One of the guards glanced at her documentation, then at David. "Who's this?" "Corporal Jenkins. My assistant." She sighed with practiced exasperation. "Half my staff is down with that stomach bug going around. Headquarters insisted the refugees be processed today regardless." The mention of headquarters worked its subtle magic. Few enlisted men wanted to question orders supposedly coming from above, especially for something as routine as medical checks. "Go ahead," the guard said, stepping aside. "But be quick about it. These refugees get antsy around uniforms." The civilian section consisted of 3 large tents arranged around a central cook fire. Unlike the ordered military precision of the main camp, this area had the improvised quality of all refugee centers. Laundry strung between tent poles, makeshift seating created from supply crates, the quiet murmur of multiple languages mixing in the air. About 20 civilians occupied the space, mostly women and children, with a few elderly men among them. Their faces bore the hollow-eyed look of those who had seen too much, endured too much, lost too much. Some watched David and Nurse Wilson with wary suspicion. Others didn't look up at all, as if they'd learned that invisibility was their best protection. David scanned the faces anxiously, searching for Elise among them. A flash of movement caught his eye, a small figure darting between 2 older women. Elise spotted him at the same moment. Her face transformed, relief breaking through the careful mask she'd constructed. She took a step toward him, then stopped, uncertainty replacing her initial reaction as she noted his different uniform and the presence of Nurse Wilson. David gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Trust me." She remained where she was, but her posture relaxed slightly. "Start with the children," Nurse Wilson said loudly enough for the guards to hear. "Check vaccination records first." They moved through the tent systematically, maintaining the pretense of medical examinations while working their way toward Elise. When they finally reached her, David knelt to her level despite the pain it caused his shoulder. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly, pretending to check her throat. She nodded, eyes darting to Nurse Wilson and back to him. "They asked many questions. About you. About my father. What did you tell them?" "Only that you saved me." Her voice dropped to the barest whisper. "I still have it, in my shoe." Relief washed through him. The document was safe. "Lieutenant Parker," Nurse Wilson interjected with forced casualness, "we should check her for exposure to—" Her words cut off abruptly as shouting erupted outside the tent. The unmistakable sound of jeeps roaring into the civilian area, followed by the sharp orders of military police. "Where is he?" a voice demanded. Colonel Hargrove's voice tight with barely controlled fury. David's blood ran cold. They'd been discovered. "We need to move," he hissed, grabbing Elise's hand. "Now." Nurse Wilson pointed toward the back of the tent. "There's a supply entrance. Go." They slipped through the canvas flap just as MPs burst through the main entrance. Outside, chaos had engulfed the civilian area, refugees being herded into lines, soldiers searching through personal belongings, Hargrove's voice rising above the confusion with cold authority. "No one leaves until we find them. Check every tent, every crate, every damn bedroll." David pulled Elise behind a stack of supply crates, mind racing. The perimeter fence was only 20 yards away but heavily guarded. Even if they somehow made it past the guards, where would they go? He was in no condition to travel far, and the surrounding countryside was crawling with German patrols. "Give me the paper," he whispered to Elise. She hesitated only briefly before reaching into her shoe and extracting the bloodstained document. David unfolded it carefully, studying the contents one more time to confirm his suspicions. The operation details, the dates, the coordinates, all classified information that only 5 people in the entire European theater should have known. And there it was, in the corner, a small stylized fox, the personal mark of Colonel Hargrove. It was him, David muttered, the final piece clicking into place. He's been feeding intelligence to the Germans. A shadow fell across them. David looked up to find the barrel of a pistol pointed directly at his face. Behind it stood Colonel Hargrove, his expression a mask of cold fury. "I'll take that, Lieutenant," he said, extending his free hand for the document. MPs surrounded them, rifles raised. There was nowhere to run, no way to fight. David slowly rose to his feet, positioning himself in front of Elise. "Why?" he asked simply. "Why betray your own men?" Hargrove's mouth twitched in what might have been a smile under different circumstances. "For the same reason men have always betrayed their countries, Parker. Power. Money." He shrugged. "The Germans pay well for the right information. American soldiers died because of you," David said, disgust evident in his voice. "French resistance fighters. Innocent civilians. Casualties of war," Hargrove replied dismissively. "They would have died eventually anyway. At least this way their deaths served a purpose. My retirement fund." He gestured impatiently with the pistol. "The document. Now." David glanced down at Elise, who stared up at Hargrove with undisguised hatred. In her eyes, he saw the same look she'd given her father, recognition of betrayal in its purest form. "The girl has seen your face now," David said quietly. "Heard your confession. What happens to her?" Something cold flickered in Hargrove's eyes. "The same thing that happens to you, I'm afraid. Tragic accident during an escape attempt." The MPs shifted uncomfortably, but didn't lower their weapons. Following orders, the soldier's eternal excuse, David slowly raised the document as if to hand it over. Instead, in one swift motion, he tore it into pieces and shoved them into his mouth, chewing rapidly. "No!" Hargrove lunged forward, pistol swinging toward David's head. The blow never landed. A single shot cracked through the air, and Hargrove staggered backwards, a look of genuine surprise crossing his face as he glanced down at the spreading red stain on his chest. Behind him stood Nurse Wilson, a service revolver clutched in her trembling hands. "Traitor," she whispered. Chaos erupted as the MPs reacted. Some turned their weapons toward Nurse Wilson. Others simply stared in shock. In the confusion, David grabbed Elise and pulled her toward the perimeter fence, ignoring the fire in his shoulder. "Stop them," one of the MPs shouted, but the command lacked conviction. Word of Hargrove's betrayal was already spreading through the ranks, sowing confusion and uncertainty. Who was the real enemy? Who should they be fighting? They reached the fence as the first shots rang out behind them. Whether they were aimed at them or at others in the growing chaos, David couldn't tell. He boosted Elise over the barbed wire, then followed with considerably less grace, his uniform tearing and his wound reopening as he scraped over the top. They hit the ground running, heading for the tree line at the edge of the clearing. Behind them, the camp had dissolved into shouting and confusion. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and the slim chance of survival. "Where are we going?" Elise gasped as they reached the shelter of the trees. David had no answer. The document was gone, destroyed by his own hand. Their only evidence against Hargrove now lay in their testimony, and who would believe a wounded lieutenant and a refugee child against a decorated colonel? Yet Hargrove had been shot. Nurse Wilson had witnessed his confession. Perhaps there was still a chance for justice. "We need to reach Allied headquarters in London," he said finally. "Find someone who will listen to the truth." Elise nodded solemnly, accepting this impossible journey with the same quiet determination she'd shown from the beginning. "Together," she said, taking his hand. A shout from the camp perimeter reminded them they weren't safe yet. David led Elise deeper into the forest, each step carrying them farther from the betrayal behind and toward the uncertain salvation ahead. Mist clung to the forest floor like ghostly fingers, swirling around David and Elise as they pushed deeper into the woods. The October chill penetrated David's torn uniform, sending violent shivers through his fever-racked body. Each step became an exercise in willpower, his vision occasionally blurring as blood loss and infection took their toll. Elise walked beside him in silence, her small hand still clutched in his, occasionally tugging him back to awareness when his steps faltered. Despite everything she had endured, betrayal, loss, terror, her face remained set with a determination that belied her years. She had become his anchor, his reason to keep moving when his body screamed for surrender. "We need to find shelter," David finally admitted as twilight descended, painting the forest in watercolor shades of purple and gray. "I need to rest." Elise nodded, her eyes scanning their surroundings with the heightened awareness of a child who had learned survival too young. "There," she pointed toward a dense thicket where fallen logs created a natural hollow. "We can hide there." The makeshift shelter offered minimal protection, but it was better than nothing. David collapsed against one of the logs, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cold, a worrying sign of advancing infection. "Your shoulder," Elise said, her French accent more pronounced in her concern. "It's bleeding again." David glanced down at the dark stain spreading across his uniform. "It's not too bad," he lied. She gave him a look that would have been comical on a child's face under different circumstances, part exasperation, part disbelief. Without further comment, she began gathering moss and soft leaves, packing them against his wound with careful precision. "Where did you learn that?" David asked, watching her work with skilled hands. "My mother was a nurse," she replied, not meeting his eyes. Before the war, before hunger, before her father sold her for a sack of potatoes." The unspoken words hung between them like smoke. "We need to keep moving tomorrow," David said, changing the subject. "Find a way across the channel to England." Elise secured the makeshift bandage with strips torn from his already ruined uniform. "The resistance might help us. My father—" She stopped abruptly, the word catching in her throat. "Your father knew members of the resistance?" David prompted gently. She nodded, her movements becoming mechanical as she finished bandaging him. "He reported on them to the Germans. I heard him sometimes at night. Names, locations." Her voice dropped to a whisper. That's when I knew he had changed. The revelation settled between them, another layer of betrayal in a story already heavy with it. David wanted to offer comfort but found no words equal to such a burden. Instead, he reached out with his good arm, drawing her close against the growing chill. "Try to sleep," he said. "I'll keep watch." Despite his intention, exhaustion claimed him first. He drifted into uneasy dreams where Hargrove's face merged with that of Elise's father, both men laughing as they counted blood money. He woke with a start to find pale morning light filtering through the trees and Elise already awake, watching him with solemn eyes. "You were talking in your sleep," she said, "about Operation Foxhole." David pushed himself into a sitting position, wincing as pain lanced through his shoulder. "You know what it was?" She shook her head. "Only that it was important. Important enough for them to kill for." The simplicity of her assessment struck him with its accuracy. Operation Foxhole had been a coordinated effort to insert Allied operatives behind enemy lines, establishing direct contact with resistance cells throughout occupied France. Dozens of agents, hundreds of resistance fighters, countless civilian informants, all compromised because of Hargrove's betrayal. "People died because of that operation," David explained, choosing his words carefully. "Good people who were trying to help end this war, and they died because someone who should have protected them betrayed them instead." "Like my father betrayed me," Elise said, her voice steady despite the pain evident in her eyes. "Yes," David admitted. "Like that." She digested this in silence, her young face grave with understanding beyond her years. "What will happen now?" It was the question David had been avoiding since their escape. Without the document, their accusations against a decorated colonel would sound like the desperate fabrications of a deserter. Even Nurse Wilson's testimony might not be enough, assuming she had survived the chaos they'd left behind. "We need to reach London," he repeated, more to convince himself than her. "Find someone who will listen, someone who can investigate Hargrove properly." "And then?" Elise pressed. The question caught him off guard. In his focus on immediate survival, he hadn't considered what would happen after their testimony, after Hargrove's exposure, after the war. What would happen to Elise, an orphaned refugee with no family, no home to return to? Before he could formulate an answer, the crack of a twig breaking nearby froze them both. David reached for his sidearm before remembering it was gone, lost during their escape from the camp. He pushed Elise behind him, searching desperately for anything that could serve as a weapon. "Lieutenant Parker," a voice called softly. "Elise?" They remained perfectly still, barely breathing. The voice came again, closer this time. "It's Sergeant Miller, sir, from the camp. We're here to help." David exchanged a glance with Elise, wariness evident in both their expressions. It could be a trap, another betrayal in a war that seemed built on nothing else. "Stay hidden," he whispered to her before calling out. "Show yourself, Sergeant. Hands visible." A figure emerged from between the trees, a young soldier with a corporal's insignia, not a sergeant's stripes. Behind him came two more men in American uniforms, weapons lowered but ready. "Corporal Jenkins, sir," the first man corrected. "We've been searching for you since yesterday." David remained tense, positioning himself to shield Elise. "On whose orders?" "Major Reynolds," Jenkins replied. "After what happened with Colonel Hargrove?" He hesitated, glancing at his companions before continuing. "It's been chaos, sir. The colonel's dead. Shot while attempting to execute an American officer for treason. That's the official report." "And unofficially?" David pressed. Jenkins lowered his voice. "Nurse Wilson told Major Reynolds everything before they arrested her. About the document, about Hargrove's confession." He took a step closer, his expression earnest. "The Major believes you, sir. He's been with intelligence for years. Says he always had suspicions about Hargrove, but never enough proof." Relief washed through David, so powerful it nearly buckled his knees. Someone believed them. Someone with authority. "Nurse Wilson," he asked urgently. "Is she all right?" Jenkins nodded. "Under guard for shooting a superior officer, but the Major's intervened. Says she'll be cleared once everything comes to light." Elise stepped out from behind David, studying the soldiers with cautious eyes. "How did you find us?" she asked, her voice steady despite her evident fear. The corporal smiled, a genuine expression that softened his battle-worn features. "Tracker in our unit, half Comanche, said you were moving east but slowly because of the lieutenant's wound." He gestured toward their makeshift bandage. "Speaking of which, we have a medic with us, sir. You need proper treatment before that infection gets worse." David hesitated, the habit of suspicion difficult to break after everything they'd endured. "Why should we trust you?" Jenkins reached into his pocket, withdrawing a small object that he tossed carefully to David. It was a service medal, specifically a Purple Heart with an oak leaf cluster. "Major Reynolds said to give you that. Said it was yours from North Africa. Said you'd know it was genuine because of the scratch on the back where it hit concrete during a mortar attack in Kasserine Pass." David turned the medal over with trembling fingers. There it was, the distinctive scratch pattern he remembered clearly from a day he'd never forget. It was his medal, left behind in his footlocker at camp. "All right," he said finally. "We'll come with you." The journey back to camp was slower than their frantic escape had been. The medic, a soft-spoken man named Rodriguez, insisted on treating David's wound properly before they attempted the walk. Fresh bandages and antibiotics helped clear his head, though the pain remained a constant companion. As they approached the camp perimeter, David felt Elise tense beside him. He squeezed her hand reassuringly. "It's different now," he promised, hoping he spoke the truth. Major Reynolds met them at the command tent, a tall, angular man with intelligent eyes and premature silver at his temples. "Lieutenant Parker," he greeted them, his handshake firm. "And this must be Elise." He knelt to the girl's level, his demeanor softening. "You've been very brave," he said simply. "Both of you have." Inside the tent, away from curious eyes, Reynolds explained the situation. Hargrove's betrayal had sent shockwaves through Allied command. An investigation was already underway, with intelligence officers combing through every operation the colonel had touched during the past 18 months. "We need your testimony," Reynolds said, his expression grave. "Both of you. It won't be easy. There are those who still refuse to believe a decorated officer could turn traitor, but it's necessary." "And after?" David asked, voicing the question that had haunted him since the forest. "What happens to Elise?" Reynolds glanced at the girl who had remained silent throughout the briefing, her eyes taking in everything with that unnerving adult awareness. "She'll be classified as a war orphan, evacuated to England with other refugees, most likely, eventually placed with a foster family." The words landed like stones in David's chest. After everything they had survived together, the thought of Elise disappearing into the system of displaced persons felt wrong. Another betrayal to add to the many she had already endured. "No," he said firmly. "I gave her my word that I'd protect her. I'm not abandoning her to some orphanage." Reynolds raised an eyebrow. "What are you suggesting, Lieutenant?" David hadn't planned what he would say next, hadn't even consciously formed the thought until it emerged fully formed from his mouth. "I'll take responsibility for her. After the war, I mean. She comes with me." Elise's head snapped up, her eyes wide with disbelief and something else, a fragile hope she seemed afraid to acknowledge. "That's highly irregular," Reynolds began, but there was no real objection in his tone. "There would be paperwork, approvals needed, questions about your suitability as a guardian, given your military status." "I don't care how many forms I have to sign," David said. "She stays with me." Reynolds studied them both for a long moment, seeing perhaps what David himself was only beginning to understand, that in saving Elise, he had also saved himself. That in the midst of a war built on betrayal and destruction, they had found something worth preserving. "I'll see what I can arrange," he promised finally. "For both of you." Elise stepped forward then, her voice quiet but clear as she addressed the major directly. "He saved me when no one else would," she said simply. "When my own father traded me for potatoes." The stark statement hung in the air, powerful in its unadorned truth. Reynolds nodded once. Decision made. "Together then," he confirmed. Outside the tent, the sounds of war continued, jeeps rumbling, orders being shouted, planes overhead. But inside, in that moment of shared understanding, David felt something he had almost forgotten existed in this broken world. It wasn't quite peace, it wasn't quite happiness. But it was perhaps the beginning of healing. In the darkest moments of history, when humanity seems lost, sometimes salvation comes from unexpected places. David and Elise's journey reminds us that true courage isn't found in grand heroic gestures, but in those small, seemingly impossible choices we make when everything within us screams to look away. What would you have done if you witnessed a child being sold? Would you have risked everything for a stranger, or turned away like so many others? War reveals our true nature, stripping away pretense until only our core remains. Some, like Elise's father and Colonel Hargrove, surrender to their darkest impulses. Others, like David, discover strength they never knew they possessed. Perhaps this is the most powerful truth of all, that family isn't always defined by blood, but by those who choose to stand beside us when the world turns its back. If this story touched your heart, remember that there are still children today facing unimaginable circumstances, waiting for someone to notice, to care, to act. Be that person who makes the difficult choice. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Like the video so others can find it too, and subscribe for more stories that remind us of our shared humanity in both its darkest failures and its brightest triumphs.